Hi guys, so this video I've been meaning to do for about a year now. So it's time once again to compare the games of two of the more popular 8-bit home micros of the 1980s and early 90s. The AMSTRAD CPC 464 and my trusty Commodore 64. So determining whether the AMSTRAD is better than the Commodore 64 or vice versa can be subjective and depend on personal preference. Both platforms had their strengths and weaknesses, so what one person considers better may not be the same for another person. However, there are a few points to consider when comparing the two. The AMSTRAD had different graphics and sound architecture compared to the Commodore 64. The graphics on the AMSTRAD may have a unique look and feel that some players prefer, as it had a colour palette of 27 colours, as opposed to the Commodore's 16. The Commodore 64 was known for its excellent sound capabilities thanks to the SID chip, which may result in a different audio experience compared to the AMSTRAD's AY chip. And it's also important to note that game developers often had to make choices and sacrifices to suit each platform's hardware, and as a result, the gameplay experience could differ between the two versions. So ultimately, what makes a computer better for one particular person often comes down to personal preference, and some people may have a nostalgic connection to one over the other. For me, it's the Commodore 64, as this was my first computer, so I'll always have a sentimental attachment to it. But there are some games on the AMSTRAD that I prefer over the Commodore 64 versions, and with that being said, here are 10 games that I think are better on the AMSTRAD than the Commodore 64. So, first up is Ghostbusters 2 from Activision in 1989, and this was done by the Oliver twins of Dizzy fame, believe it or not. So first we're going to take a look at the Commodore 64 version, and as you can see, the gameplay window is quite small and the detail is very minimal, as are the colours, like the red and the brown of the air shaft. And the heads-up display along the bottom is a lot to be desired compared to the AMSTRAD version, which we'll see in a few minutes. So moving on to level 2, and the first thing you'll notice is this is a side-scrolling shoot 'em up with the Statue of Liberty. And as you can see, there's the buildings in the background are just green and brown, and there's a little bit of parallax scrolling. So let's take a look at the AMSTRAD version. And as you can see, graphically there's a lot more colour and detail in this version, and that heads-up display is so much better than the Commodore version. So at the top there you've got the Ghostbusters 2 logo, and the most impressive thing is Ray's face at the bottom. So the more you get grabbed or touched by a ghost, his face is animated and looks shocked and scared, and the red bar just to the right of his face is your health, and there are power-ups along the way. And we'll just go to the bottom just to see the detail of the Van Horn Railroad and the River of Slime. And there we are, there's ghosts flying around from left to right. Quite a few hands trying to grab me. A lot more detail on the train platform. There's even more hands coming down to cut my rope. So let's have a look at level 2 on the AMSTRAD. And this time there's a lot more colour and detail on those buildings in the background. You've still got the Ghostbusters 2 logo in the bottom right. And it just looks like a nicer version of the game. And again, you've still got that little bit of parallax scrolling in the background. And there's a lot more varied colours in the ghosts as well. So on the Commodore 64, they're just grey. But on the AMSTRAD, there's green, blue, yellow ghosts flying about. And the only gripe I've got with this on the AMSTRAD is the colour of the Statue of Liberty. For some reason they've gone for blue as opposed to green. And there are plenty of shades of green on the AMSTRAD, as you can see in the background and on the ghost. So I'm not sure why they went for blue. Now let's take a quick look at both versions side by side. Next up is Rainbow Islands, released by Ocean Software in 1990. Now, like Ghostbusters 2, I had this back in the day on the Commodore 64 and really enjoyed it, as it translated well from the arcade version. And even though the Commodore 64 and AMSTRAD versions are pretty much on par with each other gameplay wise, the AMSTRAD just tops the C64 version with its colour palette. I mean, just take a look at the rainbows, for example. So the C64 rainbows only have 3 colours: brown, yellow and light blue, whereas the AMSTRAD has the full 7 colours of the rainbow. Even the arcade version only had 6 colours in its rainbows. Rolling Thunder was released by US Gold in 1988 and was a home port of the Namco Classic from 1986. There were a lot of differences in the C64 version, mainly the look of the game, such as metal looking backgrounds and the lack of doors in the doorways, and no rails on the upper platforms to allow the guy to jump up, grab the rail and vault over. Instead, he just jumps up like he's Super Mario. Apart from the horrendous rendition of the Rolling Thunder theme tune and the blocky sprites, it's not a bad conversion. Until, that is, you compare it to the AMSTRAD version. Looking a lot more like the arcade version, the AMSTRAD Rolling Thunder is pretty impressive for an 8-bit port, complete with opening and closing doors and that handrail I mentioned, allowing a nicely animated sprite of our hero to leap over to access the upper levels. Next on our list is the puzzle game Klax by Domark in 1990, based on the arcade game from Atari. Here's the Commodore 64 version, which isn't too bad and plays very much like the arcade original, and considering the Commodore 64's minimal colour palette, the developers have done a pretty good conversion. Now, over to the AMSTRAD version. Now, I know there was two versions of Klax, one on the CPC 464 and one for the GX4000, but today we're taking a look at the original 64K version. The first thing I noticed was that the music in this version of Klax sounds a lot more melodic than the C64, and once the game starts, the AMSTRAD's colour palette really shines. This version has so much more detail and is very pleasing to the eye, even if the gameplay window is small. Now let's see them side by side. Next up is the classic beat-em-up Renegade from Imagine in 1987. Now, I didn't play this much when I was younger, as I preferred the sequel Target Renegade, but now I can appreciate how the developers wanted to emulate the arcade version's control system by having the player use the joystick for movement and 3 keys for attacking left, right and jump. Here, the Commodore 64 version scrolls nicely and has a great rendition of the Renegade theme tune thanks to the SID chip, but it's let down by the blocky sprites which lack detail. Moving on to the AMSTRAD version, and even though this version flick scrolls, I think it plays that little bit better than the Commodore 64. And as for the sprites, well, they look very detailed and do their arcade counterparts justice. Even the AY sound chip does a banging job at the Renegade theme. Well, you probably guessed that I would include this at some point on this list. 1988's Robocop by Ocean. Now, the Commodore 64 version is completely different to the other 8-bit ports of the game. First off, there's the pointless jump mechanic, as there is nothing to jump from or onto, it's just a run and gun. Secondly, you only have the one life, and once your energy bar is depleted, it's game over. Thirdly, you have an endless supply of bullets, and when you do collect the power-ups, there's no indication of how many of these bullets are remaining. Then there's the infamous Robocop Commodore 64 glitch, but that's a story for another time. The AMSTRAD version shares the same code as the ZX Spectrum Robocop, and this time you have 3 lives to make things easier, no jump option, and symbols in the lower left corner showing how many bullets you have left. After they run out, you have to rely on your fists. There's also more varied enemies, including chainsaw wielding maniacs and guys trying to take you down with flying kicks. Also, the crosshair during the hostage levels is more akin to the one in the film and the arcade version. And of course I had to include this game in my list as it's one of my favourite games of the era, Batman the Movie by Ocean from 1989. Back in the day, I thought the Commodore 64 was the definitive version on the 8-bit computers, but as I got older and wiser, I realised corners were cut. No, not those corners. I'm talking about the enemies in the game. Now, the Batman sprite has been lovingly created and looks the part and is animated well. The bad guys, however, well, it's like they just couldn't be arsed. Very little detail, and most of them just run backwards and forwards, shooting their guns randomly. Even the guys throwing the grenades are just welded to the spot. I mean, look at the Joker. That's the main bad guy. And he looks like a pink and green blob. Anyway, onto the AMSTRAD version. And this time the enemies are actively seeking you out and climb ladders and stairs in order to get to you. Even the grenade guys are pacing about this time. And if you listen, you'll notice there's both music and sound effects at the same time, whereas on the Commodore 64 you could only choose one or the other. Like on the ZX Spectrum version, there's even helicopters in places during the carnival level, and rats and breakaway floors in the cathedral, all of which are absent in the C64 version. Next up is Chase HQ by Ocean from 1989, based on Tato's classic coin-op. And I think when the guys at Ocean did the Commodore 64 version, they were joking. I mean, what even is this? Where do I even start? I mean, if Tiger Electronics ever did an LCD game based on Chase HQ, it would be miles better than this. The car seems to trundle along at a snail's pace. The music sounds like someone's playing a melodica with their nose. And the sound effects are god awful, and don't get me started on the monochrome backgrounds. So, the AMSTRAD version doesn't have any music, but I'm sure you'll agree it's leaps and bounds better than that C64 abomination. This time there's a sense of speed as you hurtle down the road chasing the perpetrators. There's even the monitoring system intro from the arcade, briefing you on what car to look out for. This is a far better version that's a lot more enjoyable to play, despite a lack of music and for some reason no siren sound effect when you catch up with the bad guys. Gauntlet 2 was released by US Gold in 1987, based on Atari's arcade hit. So, the Commodore 64 version looks promising at first, with a nice intro with a Gauntlet 2 theme, then moves on to a brightly coloured player select screen. Then the game begins, and although it plays okay, it just seems a bit meh, with very few sound effects, basic sprites that are barely recognisable as the characters they're meant to be, for example the grunts. And what's up with Warrior's white hair? Has he seen a ghost or something? Oh yeah, just a few. So let's take a look at what the AMSTRAD had to offer. And straight away you can see it looks so much better. The sprite of Warrior looks like it should. The grunts look like, well, grunts. The sound effects are on point, and things like treasure chests, enemy huts and food items are all as close as they can be to the ones seen in the arcade version. Even the green blobs of slime are present in level 3, unlike the Commodore 64 version. Well, we've reached number 1, and that game probably has the longest name for a video game ever. Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters was a 1989 arcade game from Atari, and ported to home computers by Dunn in 1990. The Commodore 64 version is, well, see for yourself. I mean, it looks like a Spectrum port. There's a lack of elevators, so the only way to get to the upper levels is by ladder. All the hostages are tied to walls as opposed to being forced to operate computers to create a robot army, like in all the other versions. The only redeeming features are in-game music, scrolling, and a better control system. The AMSTRAD version looks breathtaking in comparison. Despite no music and flick scrolling, it more than makes up for it in detail, colour and presentation. Even the hostages are busy at their workstations creating the robot army. And look! Elevators! Now, the only thing I didn't like about this port is the controls. As I said, I preferred the Commodore 64 control system, as that uses the traditional up, down, left, right to move your character in that direction. Both the AMSTRAD and the ZX Spectrum, for some reason, have a control system where left and right rotates the character, up moves him in the direction he's facing, and down drops your bombs. And as you can probably tell, I'm still getting used to these controls. So those are my top 10 games that I think are better on the Amstrad than the Commodore. But what do you guys think? Are there any games I should have included in this list? So I started off with about 20 odd games and I whittled them down to 10. So let me know in the comments and maybe I'll do a follow-up video to this. Anyway, thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, bye!